So, Atheism Plus. We might as well just bring that thing up.
So I've been following this Atheism Plus thing, and I'm not really big on blogs, so there hasn't been anything to make a video about until Agent of Doubt put up this panel debate, and I have some thoughts on things that were said.
The ACA, we actually have a blog post on our blog at Free Thought Blogs. We've always been Atheism Plus. And to a certain extent, everybody's Atheism Plus something.
And this is a large part of why Atheism Plus as a movement is being criticized. All atheists, the way you are formulating this identity, are already Atheist Plus. And you're not attempting to control the atheism, but you are attempting to control the plus. So you are telling people what to believe based on their connection to you as fellow atheists. You think that that gives you some right to define the plus. That's the criticism. That is a large part of what the criticism has been.
Because if you're going to go all-out dictionary atheist, just lack a belief in God, you can't even get to separation of church and state, atheist destigmatization, wanting other people to be atheist. You can't even get there.
Which is why a number of atheists, myself included, consider an atheist movement to be counterproductive. You are not coming from a coherent position that's defined by the basic values entailed by the label. Instead, you are using the identity in order to further whatever your personal agenda is. You're attaching your values to the wrong group identity. It's not through atheism that you're going to have these issues addressed. Atheism simply doesn't mean attachment to any of these issues.
So those things are just as much, not atheism as feminism and gay rights and everything else.
Now, here you're wrong. Dead wrong. Because there is a common interest that atheists share. All atheists. And that is secularism. Now, some atheists take this very strongly. I take the issue of secularism very weakly. The issue of separation of church and state. This issue is of primary importance to all atheists because it defines the space by which atheism can exist. No material sanctioned government penalties for not believing in God or following any form of religion. This is fundamental to the existence of atheism, and as such is the common denominator to which any and all atheist movements can and must subscribe. This is where atheist identity comes from and what it relies on. This is what unites all atheists in common cause, secularism. Without it, we can't be atheists. That is all.
Yeah, I was going to say, Tracy and I actually were having this conversation over lunch, that if you're just dictionary atheism and that's all, there's nothing else to your atheism, you're actually irrelevant to this conversation.
She goes on to say she doesn't mean that as an insult, fair enough, but stop and take a look at what's actually being said. If you are not a part of what we are pushing for, then you are irrelevant to us. What does this mean? That dissent will not be accepted, conversation will not be had, echo chambers are encouraged? To me, it means that people who are atheists are going to be marginalized by this attempted movement. Anyone who does not agree with us is irrelevant to us. That's not a very wise starting position for a movement that wants to represent people.
A couple things. First of all, yes, definitely. The atheist movement, to the degree that it is a movement, and to the degree that it is a community.
Now, she does this a lot, and I love this. On the one hand, I appreciate the attempt at understanding the complexity and the subtleties of the issue involved. On the other hand, you make so many statements that rely on these implicit definitions, these value judgments and value statements. The atheist movement, for example. There has to be an atheist movement in order for you to talk about the direction and the values and the line discipline. You started this off by saying the atheist movement, and now you're qualifying everything that you've said with a statement to the extent to which it is a movement. This is going to be a running theme in everything that she talks about. Making this statement, relying on this definition, and then putting some qualifier on the extent to which we can talk about this. I find it to be evidence of very sloppy, fundamental examinations, what led into this debate, what led into this debacle, that she was willing to throw around these terms very loosely leading up to this point, and now she's attempting to qualify them without backing down from the positions that she's quite overextended herself into, is what it looks like to me.
Is already taking on lots of issues. It's already taking on, obviously separation of church and state, which is, Beth points out, it's a fairly obvious conclusion from becoming an atheist, but, it's not inherent.
I've already stated my rejection of this claim, but I'll reiterate it here. Yes, separation of church and state and secular society is not just a fairly obvious conclusion of atheist identity. It is the very foundational basis of which any atheist movement must adhere. Without a separation of church and state, without a secular society, there is no place to be an atheist. An established religion is an existential threat to the identity of atheism.
That some people in the atheist movement want to explicitly take on social justice issues as they intersect with atheism.
And they are free to. And for what it's worth, I don't think that most people care if you call yourself atheist plus, if you call yourself whatever else you want to call yourself. What labels you put on yourself are up to you. They might be good descriptions that are useful for people understanding what you represent. They might be bad descriptions that are not useful for people understanding what you represent. You yourself, the way this was presented just earlier in the video, agreed that atheism plus is not a very useful label. The plus could be anything, absolutely anything. And all of the positions that you argue for are not inherent and are not logically derived from the basic position, which is atheism. So it's not a very useful label, and that's a lot of the criticism you're getting is frustration from people attempting to connect with you on a rational level to explain this, and not getting much of a reaction in response. I mean, it's a criticism, and the answer to the criticism is, well, yes, it's not a very descriptive label.
And to some extent that means just taking on social justice issues internally and making sure that our own communities and our own organizations are inclusive of women, inclusive of African Americans, inclusive of Latin Americans, inclusive of people with disabilities, inclusive of working class people and other marginalized people.
That's a long list, and I have nothing against any of those groups of people that she mentioned. But when she or other defenders of atheism plus say this is just about our own definition, or this is just about setting aside our own space, no, this is about disciplining atheists who hold positions that you don't agree with, and not doing it by engaging them in the actual issues, skeptically, critically, based on evidence, but instead pointing them out and marginalizing them, getting them out of these atheist communities that you have established and that you think so highly of.
And just making sure that our own houses are more or less in order.
And we do that in the atheist community. There is an awful lot of pushback on people who attempt to do stupid and idiotic things. The Amazing Atheist was brought up as an example on Free Thought blogs of popular atheists saying misogynistic things and not receiving any censure for it. And that is simply not the case. There was a large discussion that went on, and people rushed to the Amazing Atheist's defense. And I would not present a system where that does not occur, where no one comes up to the defense of someone who has said something stupid and is now being pilloried by the community. I encourage the discussion. I will listen to what people have to say in defense of someone who's been accused of being ableist, sexist, heterophobic, transphobic. I will listen to the points that are made. I may put my response in as well, but I want people engaging each other rationally, critically, skeptically, and in terms of evidence. What people actually said, what they actually endorse, and how this, whatever frustrating thing has just occurred, whatever stupid thing they've just said, is exceptional, or if it is part of an ongoing pattern of behavior. I do not want to marginalize people and kick them out of the movement, deny them their atheist label whenever they say something that puts the house out of order. That's the difference.
Another thing I would say is if you don't want to participate, that's fine. If you want to participate in the traditional atheist forms of activism, that is awesome, that's fine. Nobody is saying you have to do this. If you're giving active hostile pushback, nobody basically what it says, nobody is saying if you're not with us, you're against us.
Wrong. Demonstrably, provably wrong. This has been stated. Specifically, I'm aware of Richard Carrier saying exactly that. And when questioned in comments on the blog post, not clarifying of the way you just did, of saying, no, you're free to do what you want, but instead going on the attack. Now, if you want to repudiate those statements, then that is fine. I encourage that. If you want to say Richard Carrier does not speak for the whole movement, then do that. But you must repudiate the statements in order to keep them from being attached to what you're doing. That is the important point here. When you, instead of repudiating the statements, claim that they did not occur, when they are in fact on the record and have been commented on up to this point, then you are presenting, what, dishonesty, cognitive bias? There's something going on there that makes me very uncomfortable. You must understand, atheists as a group tend to not like people who deny the facts. This has been stated. If you aren't with us, you're against us. That any skepticism is taken as active, hostile pushback. Perhaps, for example, because I sound exasperated, I am therefore being hostile to the movement, hostile to Atheism Plus. And in fact, you could say that a lot of the skepticism towards Atheism Plus is hostile towards the people who are pushing it. But that's what you get when you have people like Richard Carrier making statements that those who are not with us are against us. If you're not part of Atheism Plus, then you're part of Atheism Less. You are a misogynist and a douchebag, and the whole point of Atheism Plus is to push you out of atheism. These statements have been made.
What we're saying is, if you're against us, you're against us, which is kind of tautologically true. But the other thing I want to say that I think may be a little bit more controversial is, so people are saying, well, this is divisive, you know, it's like you want to form your own thing and you want to split off and become a splinter group. And I think the point I want to make is this community is already divided.
To the extent that it is a community, I am not a movement atheist, so to me the issue of the movement being divided is not something that's really relevant to me. I don't much care. And I think a lot of the atheists who are saying this, who are presenting this criticism, are in the same camp. Our position is, if you want to present a strategically strong front, then you need to have as much unity as you can. But, you know, I could just as easily say you have to have core doctrine, something that appeals to people. To stick to that, you need to actually marginalize and push out and get rid of people who do not conform to whatever the central values of the movement are. So, I mean, as far as that goes, the strategically incorrect thing was adopting the label atheist plus. Because that creates the impression that you're trying to push people out of atheism, out of having discussions of these issues from an atheist perspective. So, for example, if you are a racist and an atheist and you want to justify racism from an atheist perspective, you're automatically disqualified and automatically not welcome. And it seems to me that that is how you're attempting to set the game, how you're attempting to set the rules up. And my response to you would be that's not a very skeptical thing to do. If you want critical thinking to be associated with atheism plus, then you need a different label, and you need to focus not on rejecting people for their anti-human ideas, but instead engage them logically, present your facts, destroy their evidence, and you can ridicule them along the way, but that's what the focus needs to be on. Winning the intellectual debate, not relying on social politics to get them out of the debate.
You know, there have already been divisions in this community, in this movement for some time now, especially over the issues of sexism and misogyny.
Now, I feel that this is worth addressing. There is sexism and misogyny within the community to the extent that it's a community. And it's not right. It's something that is worth speaking out against. The concern that most people have within this community, to the extent it is a community, is where we draw the lines. It's not actually a statement that misogyny is okay, that sexism directed towards anyone, misogyny, misandry, transphobia, homophobia, that any of these things are acceptable. The question is where you draw the line and what you believe the sanctions should be. As I stated earlier, if it's just an aberrant, if someone had a bad day, if they are being corrected and are just in the process of learning, or if it's something that represents a pattern of behavior. Those are really the questions. That's really where the division is. Which of those apply? Not the question of, is sexism cool? Is it acceptable? Is it something we should all do? Just about everybody that I talk to, whose videos I watch, who I'm in discussions with in the atheist community, is a gender egalitarian. And that's where the pushback against feminism comes from. It is not an attempt to institutionalize sexism or look the other way when people are marginalized in the atheist community. That's not the difference, the division as I see it.
But over other issues as well that have to do with social justice. We're already divided, and a lot of women in this movement have felt like we are being cut out. We're being cut out by overt misogyny within the movement and really hateful, ugly stuff. You know, I get rape threats, and I don't even want to tell you some of the details of the rape threats I get. They're very nasty.
You should, because then it would be evidence as opposed to anecdote. There have been calls from a number of users for the evidence of these threats to be published. And for what it's worth, I think that that is perfectly fair from a skeptical, critical point of view. Now, I am willing to fiat that the extent to which this has happened I find totally inappropriate and unacceptable. Anyone who does this sort of thing only makes themselves look ridiculous. My advice to anyone, though, is if you receive a hateful or a threatening comment, report it to any appropriate authorities. That is my advice. So if it's on YouTube, you can flag it and report it as abusive or as hate speech or as a threat. Many jurisdictions have laws regarding cyberbullying. Take advantage of those laws if you find yourself the victim of harassment over the internet. The frustration that I have with the people at Free Thought blogs bringing up these alleged threats is that they do not give the advice that I just gave. They are not attempting to educate or inform people on what their rights are, what their power of recourse is. Instead, they are parading these as evidence of the righteousness of their cause, the necessity of their political movement. I find that to be very disingenuous, particularly when the evidence behind these claims has not been presented.
If you go to my blog and search for the hashtag men call me things, you'll see some of them.
I'm not impressed. What I mean by that is not that I don't think that people are calling you things that are undeserved and that are unproductive. Those are there, but evidence of rape threats is what you just said. You're not supporting that claim with evidence, which makes you a pretty bad skeptic. The criticism that came out of Elevator Gate that continues to promulgate is that radical feminists within the atheist movement do not know where to draw the line. They are willing to call anything that is critical of them misogyny as a way of dismissing it. Now, I'm not going to say that things that are posted on this blog are not misogynistic, but I'm going to say that they don't represent anything more than individual stupidity. And that's all.
A lot of women in this movement already feel like we are being pushed out. And so there's the overt misogyny, and then there's also, that's a small minority, but there's also a much larger percentage of the movement that's kind of defending these people or rationalizing it or saying it's not very important, trivializing it, saying, oh, well, yeah, that's too bad, but what are you going to do? That's the internet. As if sort of, you know, there's nothing you can do about jerks on the internet.
Well, there's plenty that you can do. I've listed a few of the things here for anyone who thinks that I am participating in this marginalization, defense, or rationalization of misogyny. I am not. The primary thing that we need to do is build each other up through our positive relationships so that when we receive criticism that is overtly negative, we have the self-esteem to take it on, address it, and marginalize it on our own, that we do not have to call upon others in the community to come champion us in our defense. In defending ourselves, we will see people who are worth talking to, who share our values and so forth, come in and take our side through simple, helpful comments or thumbs up on the things that we do. In terms of the other end of the spectrum, because when it comes to trolling, which does occur on the internet, I can't stress enough that you need to know when to back off and not feed the trolls. Outside of that, when it comes to real serious issues, for example, you brought up the specter of rape threats, then yes, there's quite a lot that you can do. You should be familiar with what the laws regarding cyberbullying are in whatever jurisdiction you reside in, and whatever the terms of service are on whatever internet service that you are using, and take full advantages of your recourses for reporting cyberbullying, threats, intimidation, and harassment. I don't think you bring this point up once in this entire conference.
And so to say, oh, this is divisive, it's like this community is already divided. And I feel like to some extent, you know, we need to say what our priorities are. Are our priorities including women, or are our priorities including misogynist creeps who issue rape threats on the internet?
My priority is arguing for the truth using skeptical methodology, showing critical thinking. I do not care who is included based on their exterior characteristics or marginal identification. What I care about is attempting to promote an objective, scientifically literate, philosophically sound system of thought. You are not focusing on any of the core issues of critical thinking and skepticism. Instead, you are focusing on the exterior characteristics of people's gender, their political affiliation, their self-identification. That's what's divisive. That's where the fucking problem is. It is not in attempting to promote positive values that are pro-human. It is attempting to divide who we do or don't include based on these kinds of exterior characteristics that have nothing to do with philosophical, intellectual, critical ideas, evidence, and other core issues that should be bringing us all together in our shared humanity. Sexual preference, gender identity, neurotypicalism, none of these issues run contrary to facts or rationality. But you don't seem to have any interest in any of those. What you have interest in is people's exterior characteristics. That's the problem.
Some of us are saying we want to do our own thing. We want to have our own space. And that's essentially what Atheism Plus is right now. Atheism Plus, to the degree that it's a tangible thing, is it's a group of people with shared interests and values who want to get together and talk and plan actions. When has that ever been seen as divisive in our community? You know, if somebody says it's like, we're an atheist group and we want to go work on, we want to make an atheist soup kitchen. Who says that's mission drift? Soup doesn't have anything to do with atheism.
Is anyone actually making this argument or making this criticism, or are you addressing a straw man? It seems to me that at this point, with as much criticism as has been presented, you could actually address some criticism instead of presenting your own, absolutely absurd argument to just throw your weight against. Fallacy.
When someone says, I am an atheist, the question to me from a communication standpoint is, why are you communicating this?
Well, that would likely have something to do with context, such as a discussion that you're having or a question that was asked. But there's going to be a long discussion of this that you're bringing up, and I will answer your question right here. To identify yourself. As I've said before, I do not see atheism as a movement, at least not as it relates to me. I am not a movement atheist. I acknowledge that an atheist movement exists. In order to reasonably be a part of that movement, you must first be an atheist. So the levels here are implicitly being an atheist, not believing in God, and then explicitly identifying as an atheist. Once you've gone through those two steps, you can then participate in the atheist movement. Now, I do not participate in the atheist movement. I still identify myself as an atheist. On the one level, this communicates nothing. It is my identification. I think that this is very important for people's sense of self. Rather than being labeled, they identify and thereby express their own value. I personally believe in the maxim that once you have labeled me, you have negated me. The extent to which I declare myself, I refuse to be negated. So when I say I am an atheist, it doesn't have to communicate anything. It is a statement of being. In principle, I will not allow myself to be negated by being defined by others. That is the principle that is at work. As it is, being an atheist for me might be very different than being an atheist for you. And this is something that is critically important to remember about labels and self-identification. This will come up later when we get on the topic of theists.
What are you trying to say? It's, if you just want to tell me you're an atheist, okay. But is there some point to that beyond just saying I am an atheist? Is there something that you're trying to achieve by letting me know this?
Do you think it's important that people be able to identify themselves in their own language?
There's some point to being a self-labeled atheist.
Agreed. And that point is personal. And people who have a vested personal interest in the way they have identified themselves, they do not want to see that identification, the label, the group identity that they have subscribed to, be pulled off in some other direction that might be contrary to their interests.
And also, when Brett was talking about the soup kitchen, the Atheist Community of Austin has a number of community service activities. We have a couple of street cleanups, we have a blood drive. I have never once heard anybody say, what is up with those people in the group doing the blood drive? Why are they trying to make a schism? What are they trying to achieve by going out and donating blood? What does that have to do with atheism?
Yes, no one said that. And it's as much of a manipulative straw man here as it was the last time it was brought up.
But there does become an issue when part of the group dismisses, does not acknowledge, does not value, another part of the group makes that very clear.
And that is what your critics fear that you are doing with Atheism Plus. Rather than holding dialogues and conducting arguments where you connect to people based on the things that they are saying, defending your own positions robustly, finding ways to express your narrative to different groups of people, find ways to make arguments appealing. For example, we have this discussion of what's the difference between being feminist and gender egalitarian. Can MRAs claim that title of gender egalitarian, or are they as guilty of implicit sexism as they oppose feminists for? And if we agree that MRAs, by taking on men's issues, are implicitly sexist, then are we also arguing that feminists, by taking on women's issues, are implicitly sexist? And is the position of gender egalitarian necessarily sexist by denying the negative issues faced by either gender? For example, that's the criticism that I've received, that by staking a claim, by making a point that I don't care who has it worse, I don't care if historically or in contemporary society, men or women have been more abused by society. What I'm interested in is stopping all abuses of society. and putting people in a position where they make rational, informed decisions to govern their own lives. I'm not interested in any narrative telling people what they should or shouldn't be doing with their body, their gender expression, their sexuality. Now, I have those conversations. I don't block people or delete their comments or tell them to piss off simply for disagreeing. Now, based on behavior, I may do any of those things. I may block people. I've only a couple times removed comments. I encourage people not to do these things, but it's not going to be because you don't want me to be here, or you don't like my opinion. What you're talking about is establishing some kind of parallel thought stream, and that's the problem. That is what has nothing to do with atheism, not these positive social things that you're talking about. It's where do we have the dialogue? And I mean, for what it's worth, you can start up your own forums and only allow people who fit within your criteria to comment. That's fine, but I'm going to attack the pretension that that is somehow a bastion of free thought. And I mean, the more you want to push that, well, free thinking and free thought are two different things, then that just kind of proves my point. It means that everything that you're doing is just pretension. It's a show that you're putting on for yourselves, for each other. And this is going to come up in a little bit. We're going to hear a conversation about what the whole point of this is supposed to be.
I don't understand the defensive reaction that people have to immediately wanting to say, I mean, I can understand not wanting to be racist, but I can't understand the idea of thinking that just because I don't think I'm racist doesn't mean that I'm somehow, it means that, how would I think I'm immune to that kind of social indoctrination, especially after being a theist for so many years.
And similarly, how do you know that you're not doing it now? One of the issues that I attempt to combat in my vlogging is the assumption of intellectual and philosophical superiority that atheists make concerning Christians. And I'm putting this in as a positive point because it is true. Cognitive bias is something that we all experience. It is a part of our thought process. We rely on previous information and abstract thinking in order to make predictions about the future and objects in our environment and how they will relate to us. It's a defense mechanism, and it is part of how we are wired. It's something that we do. What I'm against is creating safe spaces, so to speak, where people can just talk and have their biases confirmed back to them. The real reason for me why I find Atheism Plus, I don't know, disturbing is not the right word, but counterproductive, is it removes, just by definition, right out of the gate, such important pieces of information, feedback from people who disagree with you, people who are critical of your opinions. And I don't think there's anything wrong with stopping people from being abusive. Personally, I think I have a pretty high tolerance for it, but I reserve the right to stop conversation with someone who is abusive at any point. The problem that I have is in conflating abusiveness, rape threats, death threats. I mean, I've had people leave comments about my body and my physicality. It's not like this isn't something that men can't picture. Of you do a video and then someone's comment is, wow, you're so pale, having nothing to do with information, having nothing to do with the content. But that's just the difference. Where this word trolling comes up, that's criticism with no content. But there is criticism with content, substantive criticism, and there will continue to be. And And it's not the issue of the atheism plus that for me is the big deal. It's that once you've established this ideological safe space where criticism is not coming in, where exterior information is being kept by the gatekeepers, then at that point you have something that is dangerous, or at least counterproductive.
I mean, yes, I get the horrible misogynistic trolling, and then I get the sort of, what in some ways is more upsetting, which is the reflexive defensiveness of the horrible misogynistic trolling, the people trivializing and saying it's not important. I also get just so many emails and so many comments from men who are saying, my eyes have been opened.
And some men who are in this category have opened up my eyes in the last year or so, but in entirely the opposite direction. I skipped over earlier a discussion of elevator gate, and I criticized Rebecca Watson at the time, but a lot of the men who came to her defense were not rational in their approach to the issue. And when they're coming up to me and saying, yes, women should always fear men, or this response is justified because when you're getting hit on by someone who's twice your size, and then name some other exterior characteristics that are common to men and say, therefore, the fear is justified, the loathing is justified, the hyperbolic discussion is justified. I would, at the beginning, was quite willing to be on Rebecca Watson's side, but I really was keyed into elevator gate by men who were defending her, and some of the really ridiculous exaggerations that they made in their case of why she should be afraid of a random pickup line.
In the last year, saying I had no idea, I did not understand what it was that women in this world go through until we started having this conversation.
Which is basically what Richard Dawkins said about Rebecca Watson, that she has not engaged in a critical conversation to understand what women in this world go through.
And I want to emphasize that it's opt-in. The label is opt-in. What you do about it is opt-in. Nobody's forcing you. And like PZ said, we're not lining somebody up against the wall and shooting off all the people that don't adopt atheism plus.
I've been giving this a lot of thought, and actually this to me relates to something Yes I Am James said about being an MRA, that when you have a community that you rely upon for support, social, moral, and emotional support, then you do not want to go against the grain. You don't really want to call people out and be combative within the group. And I mean, personally, I think that is a huge problem for the MRM, that they're not self-critical enough. They don't have robust enough dialogue amongst each other. And that's what I see as being the primary problem with Atheism Plus, that you have this group of atheists who just don't want to waste time arguing with atheists who disagree with them. And when you say that it's just opt-in, people participate if they want to, if they don't, well, the problem here is that if they do participate and then disagree, then the stated mission goal, remember, as expressed by Richard Carrier, is, well, they're going to be ostracized. They're going to be drummed out. They are going to be pointed to and laughed at. They're going to be taken off lecture circuits. They're going to be not just blocked and shooed away and their comments deleted, but they are going to be publicly ostracized. They're going to be forced to defend themselves and make apologies. They're going to get labels put on them. They're going to be thrown out of the community and fed to the wolves. That's the problem. The issue of groupthink, of ostracism, of shaming tactics. And again, you're presenting a straw man of saying, well, it's not divisive because, and then here's this criticism that you're not being criticized for. The issue is how you can control and manipulate people by holding the threat of being outside of the community.
So your atheism is just dictionary atheism? Okay.
Well, there's something I just, we'll probably want to open this up to questions, but there's something I wanted to riff on what you said, which is, when people say, oh, this is mission drift, or we can't take on this extra baggage, women are not baggage. African American.
And I agree. I cut it off here because the clapping drowns out what she's saying, but yes, exactly. The people who are a part of your community are not baggage. They are people. They have real human differences that have to be respected and addressed. Now, what you're saying is if someone is racist or if someone is misogynist, then they should be considered baggage. They should not be considered atheists, the same value as any other atheists, and the things that they have to say contributing to atheism. Now, I must point out here, I do not think that sexism or racism have any value, but I do think that they should be discussed. And more importantly, the people who have these tendencies or have this negative behavior, we should not be looking at them as failed atheists or terrible people or horrible douchebags who have no place among our ranks. We just had this conversation of cognitive bias and how we can all suffer from it. And indeed, most atheists at one point or other believed at least one thing that they now consider disgusting. So we should not be looking at these people, these horrible misogynist trolls, as baggage that needs to be excised. We should be looking at them as fellow atheists and human beings who have incorrect beliefs, who hold incorrect positions upon which they can be corrected. And that should be done through reasoned, evidence-based, skeptical argumentation in an open environment.
At what point do you think atheism, or atheists as a whole, will be politically relevant? Because right now we're not really politically relevant.
When we are willing to acknowledge secularism as our primary interest, based on it being an existential threat to our identity as atheists, and also a value that we can lobby to anyone, regardless of their faith or their label or how they relate to this issue, based on the intrinsic human value that comes from separation of church and state and a secular government. Then we'll have coherent policies that are politically relevant, not just to us, but to everyone.
They've gotten on this bandwagon, we're confrontational, we're hardcore, and that's all great. And you don't need to respect religious ideas, but you need to respect religious people. And you need to respect women, and you need to listen. And if there are feminists out there that are spouting, bullshit, then yes, call them on it, and don't be afraid just because, they're feminist. But if you're not sure that it's bullshit, and you don't have evidence to say that it's bullshit, then you don't need to be saying it's bullshit.
All right, so I'm putting this in here as something, a positive note that I at least marginally agree with. You should be deciding your positions and running your discussions and debates off of evidence and reasoned argument, not just drawing lines in the sand of us versus them and just swinging away at anything that people say, disagreeing based on the person who's giving you the information. However, keep in mind that we are talking about the philosophy of skepticism. So no, I am not going to assume that something is true until I have any concrete, solid evidence that it is, in fact, unremitted bullshit. What I am going to do is be skeptical of claims that are made and ask myself, what would be the evidence that would confirm or disconfirm whatever it is that this individual has been saying? And this is a big problem among skeptics with what I'll term here radical feminism. relying on concepts like privilege, patriarchy, rape culture, that really cannot be demonstrated, these sort of sociological theories. It's like Marx's theory of class, that when you have a structured society that has definitive strata and social lines, then you can talk coherently, cogently about class. But when you have a diverse society where anyone can attain political power, at least notionally, everyone is a producer and a consumer. Everyone has equal access to information, at least notionally. Then it becomes very difficult to make arguments about class warfare in society. It becomes hyperbolic. And this is why skeptics call bullshit on feminism. So I agree with part of what's being said here, but not like feminism should get some kind of special exemption from skepticism, that if you don't know for a fact that something a feminist is saying is bullshit, then just assume it's true. But for what it's worth, I certainly agree with this sentiment that you have to maintain an open mind. Don't dismiss information just because of who it comes from. It comes from a feminist, or comes from the opposite, from an MRA or a racist or so forth. But yes, always be skeptical.
You know, most of us have some areas where we're privileged and some areas where we're marginalized. You know, I, for instance, I'm an atheist, I'm a woman, I'm bisexual. You know, there's other areas where I'm marginalized, and I'm white, I'm pretty comfortably middle class, I'm college educated, I'm American. You know, so there's areas where I'm privileged.
And this is definitely an aside to the Atheism Plus issue, but in terms of this kind of feminist social construction theory and privilege theory, this is one of the problems that I have. As I discussed earlier, we are now fixated on judging people based on their exterior characteristics. Now you are judging yourself in terms of balancing your privilege versus balancing your marginalization. And when people start doing that, having that comparison of, well, okay, so now look at me, and in what areas am I marginalized? And if we come up with none, then what do we conclude from that? Where does that get us? Does that mean, therefore, that you should dominate a larger spectrum of people's time and attention than I should because I am a white cisgendered male? Well, maybe it's just my privilege talking, or maybe it's my identification as a skeptic and critical thinker that your ideas and my ideas are going to be equal, greater, or less based on the evidence and reasoned argumentation that we employ, and that it has nothing to do whatsoever with issues like our race, gender, sexual identity, or other privileged or marginalized statuses.
I want to know what is the difference between A+ and secular humanism, and if there's not a difference, why would you choose to adopt a new label? It's, again, brand new to me.
Can I talk about that?
Yeah, there is a difference. The difference is that you have to be an atheist to be an A+. And that's a big difference. On the way here, the person who gave me a ride from the airport is a humanist in a humanist group. And I asked him, what is the ratio of atheists to theists in your group? And he's like, well, most of our group's agnostic. Okay, well, if you watch TAE, you know that's not an answer. He didn't answer my question. The question was, what is the ratio of atheists to theists in your group? Well, they mostly label as agnostic. Okay, well, that doesn't answer my question, because they are either atheist or they are theist.
This has become a meme in the debate that infuriates me to no end. One of the things that I despise, and among other atheists, skeptics, is false dichotomies. And what's not seemingly understood here is you can always establish a dichotomy. Always. It's kind of a joke of the hick dad who's out of touch with reality, who says to his son, there's only two kinds of people in this world, football fans, everybody else. And his logic is as unassailable as your assertion that there's only atheists and theists. You can draw this distinction however you want, as long as your definitions are internally sound. But it gets you nowhere. You do not understand people and their infinite diversity based on applying these labels. Where do you put a pantheist? Are they atheist or are they theist? Well, they don't believe in God. And if you say they believe that, well, everything in the universe is God, no, that's theism. So where do you put a pantheist? They certainly believe in spirituality, spiritual nature. They believe in the existence of things outside ourselves that we can't prove critically, but it's not a god. What about autodeists, like Scientologists, or many of the teachings of the Hindu faith, that we are the gods? Where do you place that? Theism or atheism? You aren't addressing what it is that people actually believe. And in terms of the story itself, asking the person driving her in from the airport in this humanist group, are they mostly atheists or not? It's fucking irrelevant. Their value to the group is not determined based on their identification, whether they say they're atheists, say they're agnostics. The point is, what are the social issues that they will address? What are the stances that they will take on social justice issues? Not what their fucking label is. This is the kind of bullshit that secular progressives and humanists try to get away from. Saying whether or not someone has value, whether or not you want to deal with them, whether or not you want to be a part of their community based on the label that they will take versus the label you think that they should take, this is going to come up again later.
And I want to know, what is the ratio of atheists to theists in that group? They don't know. But what they did tell me was they did have, I said, well, how many people, then let me make it easy, how many people in the group are self-declared theists? Well, we had one theist that came, and then they found out there was an atheist in the group, and they never came back. That's why we have to have an atheist group exclusively that does this, because we are vilified.
And I don't know what comes out of this story that you told that expects people to not continue to vilify atheists. You want to present this as a problem, something that happened to you. In this secular humanist organization, one person who considered themselves a theist showed up and didn't feel comfortable and left. The secular humanist group is not a safe space for religious dickheads. So what's the problem with it?
People don't like us. People think we're horrible people.
So let's form our own club where we get to be the popular kids and we can tell other people that we don't like them, they're terrible, and they're the ones who need to get out.
I don't think secular humanism, we're just going to get a real good, clear definition of what they're calling it. And some of the definitions are like, we don't put stock in supernatural explanations. Well, when I was a Christian, I wouldn't call my God supernatural.
This is actually a fantastic point, if taken in a vacuum, if taken by itself. Yes, for me, this is a very big point on why I do not accept the atheist-theist dichotomy, why I say it doesn't actually tell you anything about the psychology, what a person thinks, what they believe, how they go about thinking, how they came to their beliefs, and how they could be dissuaded from their beliefs. This is something that is absolutely fundamentally critically important for anti-theists to keep in mind. Now, as an atheist, whatever, as I've said before, it's an issue of self-identification. You being an atheist is totally independent of and irrelevant to what theists do or don't believe. But if you're trying to engage in some kind of a dialogue, an atheist movement or anti-theistic advocacy, I want to underline this in bold, circle it, and draw attention to this particular statement. It is true. Most theists, most people who believe in the supernatural, do not consider it supernatural. You have to understand this basic point of human psychology if you're going to engage them in productive dialogue.
And so it's like, well, why would I have a problem with those people? Why do I have a problem with those people? Because it's very hard for me to sit down at a table and I'm looking at the goal of trying to figure out what's best for humanity and what's best for the world and what's best for the world and what are we going to do, for the human species, when I know that a person sitting at that table has the view that every human being ever born deserves to be executed.
You do not know that. You are jumping to entitled conclusions. As I just explained, this is why I do not accept the dichotomy. You have not actually engaged people to understand what it is that they believe. You are not addressing the fact, you just pointed out that the reality of their doctrines and dogma might be quite separate from their actual thought process. They simply might not have considered the doctrinal implications that you are discussing, or they may not fucking believe them whatsoever. This is your narrative. You do not know these things, particularly if you are attaching this not to the word Christian, but to the word theist.
And that every human being ever born deserves to be tortured for eternity.
I have no great love for the Christian value of human life. I left Christianity specifically to become a humanist, or rather because of my value of humanity, the top of the philosophical and moral food chain. But this is not a valid interpretation of Christianity, that every human being deserves eternal torment, deserves eternal hell. Even in 5-point Calvinism, which is the bottom of the barrel in terms of this kind of Christianity, they still believe in redemption, salvation, and heaven.
I have no faith that this person can really work with me, any more than I have faith that they can work with me to work out the issues of racism if they're a member of the Klan. Now, again, this is me personally.
Understood. Now, if we can get rid of the little "is this divisive" straw man that you guys led with, then that would be great. Yes, you do want to be divisive. You only want people who share your values to be around you. However, this is equivocation to say that I don't feel that I can have productive discussions about race with a member of the Klan is not at all the same thing as saying I don't believe that I can have productive discussions about anything involving humanity with someone who's a theist. Because whatever your different opinions and values may be, there's still a human being.
And this is not crazy right-wing fundamentalist Christian dogma. This is every New Testament church's orthodox view, except for perhaps Jehovah's Witnesses.
I think it's a pretty self-serving distortion of the orthodoxy, but it doesn't change the fact that there are many values that they share and that you can come to an agreement on. For example, racism and sexism. You think that Orthodox Christianity in America has not made huge advances in terms of acknowledging sexism, homophobia, and transphobia? You think only the Jehovah's Witnesses have made any changes in America over the last 50 years regarding these issues, such as having women priests, having gay priests, having transgendered priests, and presenting a more welcoming environment for any of these individuals? No, you've been asleep for all of that?
I believe that everyone deserves to die or that everyone deserves to be executed. And I don't feel comfortable trying to figure out the best for a human being with somebody who does think that.
How much of the world is religious? 80%, 90%, more than that? You can't have conversations about what's best for a human being and what's best for humanity and where we're all supposed to go collectively if you are going to start off the conversation by keeping out that many people, that broad a swath of humanity. You have to be involved in a conversation with them. You have to prove your point to them that what they believe is anti-human, and be prepared to have your conviction overturned based on the evidence of their actions. Otherwise, this is nothing but an exercise in ego. This isn't about coming to decisions about humanity, about what's right, where then everyone will get involved, everyone will get on board, things will actually change. No, you don't want to talk to those people. You don't want them to be a part of the conversation. You look down on them and see yourself as being above them. You want to make decisions about them and for them without talking to them, without them having anything to say about the matter. That is totalitarian. That is impositional. That is exactly what I am against. But hey, I'm not atheist plus. I'm a humanist.
Here's what I think. I think that there is certainly a tremendous amount of overlap. You know, the Venn diagram between atheism plus and secular humanism is a lot of overlap, but they're not identical. And there's a lot of reasons why they're not identical, but I'm just going to focus on one, which is names matter and labels matter.
And I at least nominally agree. The labels that you give yourself versus the labels that are given to you, that's an issue that certainly matters. So if you call yourself atheist plus and other people call you secular humanist or progressive atheist and you prefer the label atheist plus, then that is, of course, your business, how you vocalize your own positions. Well, I'm an atheist, but that doesn't really tell me anything about my values, so my values are. But, you know, to me, as I've said, the label atheist plus actually doesn't tell me anything. If you were to say, well, I'm an atheist humanist, then that would. Atheist progressive, that would at least tell me more. But you don't seem to understand your own rule because you don't apply it to yourself when it comes to anyone who's not an atheist. To begin with, you say, if you're not an atheist, you're a theist. Then you take what to you are, and to me also, the most disgusting elements of Christian theology and apply that to the label theist. So now you have forced people who don't want the label theist to take it, and then forced upon them a specific doctrine of Christianity, even if they're not at all Christian, even if it's just that they're theist. So I would say to you, yes, labels do matter. The words you call people do matter. So you need to stop with this false dichotomy, making assumptions about people's basic lack of humanity and belief that torture and murder is acceptable and something that everyone is entitled to, even if it's something only God actually gets to do. But their belief that that's what everyone is entitled to based solely upon the label that you have given them. That needs to stop.
And different kinds of people have found themselves drawn to the humanist movement, the humanist communities, versus the atheist communities. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. And again, there's crossover and there's back and forth. There's people who identify as both. But humanism has tended, on the whole, on average, to draw people who are more diplomatic, more interested in community building, more willing to do interfaith work with religious groups that have similar goals.
And that is why humanism is in every way superior to atheism plus.
You're right, atheism is just like a belief in God, and I think you really do need to make that clear to the religious people you're talking to. If they meet an atheist, they don't necessarily know anything else about that person.
Okay, here's kind of a side. I actually do not accept the definition that atheist is just lacking a belief in God or gods. For one reason, the word atheist predates the word theist by a couple thousand years. In its original context, the word atheist was simply used as an insult. And this continued to the point that the word came into English, which came via French in the 17th century. It was over 100 years later that the word theist came into English vocabulary. Now, understandings of words change. That's the great thing about studying etymology. We are not locked down to where words came from in terms of employing their meaning. But I think the question of God or gods is actually not all that relevant in terms of assessing people, in terms of assessing what they actually believe, what their moral stances are. I disagree with the monotheists. I disagree with the religious on this point, that believing or not believing in God, I don't think is relevant whatsoever. And so I disagree with anti-theists on this point as well, that there's any kind of importance attached to this dichotomy. I reject it offhand. What I present as a sort of slightly modified definition is atheists reject supernatural explanations of natural events. And so this applies to any kind of theism, polytheism, pantheism, autodeism, deism. And I know there's people who disagree with me. That's fine. Just understand this is kind of illustrating the point of why I employ this alternate explanation. Not believing in a God does not tell you anything about what someone believes. Believing in a God only tells you one thing about what a person believes. Please understand that, yes, this is the kind of courtesy that we should expect from the religious, but we have to extend them the same courtesy as well. So,
if somebody tells you they're a Christian, what do you know about them? You don't really know very much.
Thank you. That's an excellent point, the kind of point I've been trying to make here. If someone says that they're a theist, which I don't know that anyone identifies themselves that way. And if someone is identified to you as a theist, it tells you not much about them whatsoever. Certainly not that they subscribe to Calvinist doctrine.
And so the only way to find out is to ask, what does that mean to you?
Bingo. Open lines of discussion, dialogue, really kind of the opposite of what was just expressed in response to the previous question.
I have this idea of what kind of world I want to live in. And that involves addressing things like poverty and racism and sexism and transphobia and homophobia and things like that. Okay? My atheism informs how I'm going to achieve those goals.
I don't actually think it does, except for the fact that you are an atheist. So you have no theistic beliefs or theistic strategies upon which to apply solutions to these. But I don't think there'd be as much criticism of Atheism Plus if this was an area that was actually thoroughly vetted and explored, of explanations of how being an atheist informs your approach to different kinds of social justice issues. Because I think based on the definition of atheism that you're relying on in order to have Atheism Plus, atheism does not inform your values. It does not inform your perspectives. It doesn't give you anything of value or worth with which you can address any of these issues by your definition of atheism.
Because unlike a theist, I know there's no supernatural entity who's going to swoop down and help me achieve those goals. If I'm going to achieve those goals, it has to be me and people like me getting off our asses and going out and doing the work.
And if you're relying on atheists to be those people, then you will never get that work done because there statistically are simply not enough of us. If you want people to go out, get off their asses and work because supernatural entities won't do it for them, then you have to include the religious in your debate. But you aren't even good at including the majority of atheists in the discussion, let alone theists. You're simply not going to be able to get any of the work done, and that's a reality that you have to contend with, something that you have to address. If you want to get off your ass and get the work done, then you have to have an identity and a movement that can actually mobilize people to an extent that they can address these problems in significant numbers.
There's a lot of people who the reason they left religion or the reason they started questioning religion was they saw religion having really screwed up ideas about women. They saw religion as having really screwed up ideas about gay people. They saw religion as having really screwed up ideas about African Americans.
I'm going to throw a bone here to people who criticize feminists for their politically correct language. This is an interesting example of that. It's not that the religious positions of conservatives, particularly in America, particularly Christians, have problems with African Americans. It's that they have problems with all brown people, black people. And I assume that this doesn't represent some actual fear on her part of saying black people, but just being conditioned by the language of continually saying African American, African American. But African American is an identity of people of African descent who live in America. But that politically correct term has nothing to do with the identity of people's skin color that racists attack. So, yeah, I mean, you're not describing the phenomena when you say screwed up ideas about African Americans. No, it's screwed up ideas against all people, black, brown, yellow, red, anyone who's not white.
And for a lot of people, the whole reason why they left religion was these issues, and so therefore it's a little disingenuous for atheists to say, oh, well, those issues are just totally irrelevant. For a lot of people, they're not.
Agreed on this point. And this is what really complicates these issues of, if someone says they're an atheist, what do you know about them? And this is the problem I have with the definition of sort of how the lines have been drawn in this atheist-theist debate. So what we have here is, this is the atheist position of starting things off by saying, well, no, atheist only means this. This is all you can get from the term atheist. And then start adding to it of, well, for a lot of people, atheism intrinsically means rejection of religion. It intrinsically means opposition to these anti-human historical crimes, the crimes of racism and disenfranchisement of women and homosexuals, and the horrible things that have been done to people. Reaction to that is intrinsically a part of these people's atheism. Bingo. That's why I do think it is disingenuous, as I've been saying up till now, to say atheism is just about lacking a belief in God. That I say, do you believe in God? And you go, well, I don't know. Well, then you're an atheist. Yes, I do think that is disingenuous. Just not for the reason that is being brought up here.
The major single reason atheists or as atheist groups have stayed out of social justice issues is the idea that we would then be a kiss of death to that movement. And we have probably a plurality of atheists actively involved in social justice movements, but they hide their atheism in that time. What do we do to change that?
Okay, so this is a real issue, and I really appreciate the question that this woman asked. Yes, the issue, the criticism of Atheism Plus is not the actual social values that people are bringing up, what it is that people are trying to argue for. People should be nice to each other, and race, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth. These things should not be issues. They are not part of evidence and reasoned argument. The issue here, the problem is the issue of identity. And they keep saying, they've said here many times, it's not about rebranding atheism. It's not about telling people to be an atheist. You have to be into these particular issues. But yeah, the issue here of why is it that atheists will pursue social justice issues and so forth and not identify themselves as atheists? and this is going to come up here again in a minute with a related question. But for some people, it's just not anybody else's business. Some people are attempting to avoid conflict. You know, when you say I'm an atheist, then you immediately get some kind of derision or snarky response and have to go into the defensive. But for the most part, I've been an out atheist for 10 years now. And I was in the military. You know, I was working with people who, you know, they led like Christian group on post. I never had any problems with them. Yes, there was conflict when I stated I was an atheist or responded to things that they said from my point of view, but there was never hostility. I never found that I was drummed out of a room. I never received administrative repercussions. I found that for the most part, people stopped and listened, and that's all that I expect. That's all that I ask when I have discussions with people who disagree with me on fundamental points, is that they listen. And if the questions concern reasoned argument or evidence, then I will bring those up. But if it's just a matter of people talking about their various positions or various beliefs, I listen to them and I want them to listen to me. And when that's what people do, when that's how people behave, then the stigma more or less is going to be gone. It's certainly going to be easier for us to have these discussions and identify, put on labels that are very much consistent with how we label ourselves.
Yeah, actually, one of the early criticisms of the women's movement in this country was that it was too atheist, because there were an awful lot of atheists in the early feminist movement. And yeah, it was one of those things that some people sort of tamped it down and said, okay, we're gonna be more welcoming to religious people. And actually, you know, for that stage of you know, where the women's movement was, that was the right decision, because let's face it, religion is terrible for women.
This is a statement that's made in a context that I don't particularly disagree with. Historically speaking, the big religions have been bad for women, but taken by itself, I can only say I know an awful lot of pagan women who would strongly disagree. Women engaged in moon worship and fertility worship and identification with the goddess, who would certainly disagree with this assertion. Intrinsically or inherently, religion is not bad for women. It's what your underlying social normative values are that come into the religion and are expressed through religious institutions that can be good or bad. But it's not religion itself that has a negative impact on women.
We're at the point now where, you know, it's not the kiss of death to say you're an atheist. In fact, Gloria Steinem just won Humanist of the Year. She describes herself as spiritual, which I disagree with.
What the Now, I know this is just an aside, but this is something that gets right under my skin. As I've discussed before at the beginning of this video, the issue is one of personal identification. It's how you identify as yourself that keeps you from being negated by the social manipulation of others. It is none of your business how Gloria Steinem wants to define herself. Now, there are some factual levels of, for example, S.E. Cupp makes her dime. She makes her shilling off of being a conservative atheist. That is what she markets, and that's how she's brought out on camera as, well, you're an atheist, but you still believe in conservative values. At that point, it is perfectly acceptable to challenge whether or not she really is an atheist. It's relevant. And so the issue of Gloria Steinem, if she describes herself as spiritual, that's an expression of herself. There's nothing for you to disagree with, unless perhaps you're saying you personally know her well enough that you can vouch that she has no spiritual beliefs. It is none of your business. So what does this statement mean? I disagree with her. This relates back to the fundamental issue of where Atheism Plus is getting its criticism from. You are involved in telling people how they should identify themselves. That's not a good thing.
And if there are movements who really make it clear that we're not welcome, if we're out atheists, we can make alternatives. You know, the American Cancer Society didn't want atheist teams, so we moved to, leukemia and lymphoma and, other cancer charities.
And I wanted to highlight this as a positive thing. Like, yes, exactly. Build your allies where they are in terms of finding common ground. And yes, avoid the victim mentality of, oh, I just don't want to work with people who think this about me. Right, related to your positive or negative experience with groups or individuals, go from there. Don't start off with the definitions, poison the well, and then just refuse to deal with people based on that kind of a priori analysis.
I continue to be blown away by the fact that we can lose a PR battle against a group who has like a tradition of oppressing gays, oppressing women, supporting racism and slavery.
I am not, based on what you have expressed on this panel concerning how you see PR and these larger issues working. We are in the minority. Atheists represent at most 20% of human beings. And you want to not listen to the 80%. You want to push them out and not sit at the table with them and have anything to do with them. And then you say you don't understand how we can lose a PR battle. You want the ability to speak for a humanity that you frankly don't understand.
I mean, this is a group that has been on the side of wrong on every issue historically forever.
Human sacrifice. Wait, was that the religious who started it and the religious who stopped it? Or was that competing religions? You're making very broad, unsubstantiated claims that have nothing to do with historical fact. I just wanted to point that out.
And yet, because there's some good people that go into that church, somehow, if you knock it, you're vilified.
I don't vilify people who knock or attack religion. Again, I'm not sure what it is you're talking about. There's a certain segment of the population that will react reflexively to anything that challenges their religion. It's a larger, more noticeable phenomena in the Middle East than it is in America. But what do you mean by vilified? I don't see people getting tarred and feathered, rode out of town on a rail today. The criticism that you receive might have something to do with you and what you actually say.
And at one time, I guess I compared it to calling out the KKK and having somebody say, well, but some people just go because they like picnics.
Yes, and it's a stupid analogy. The KKK, which has only one stated goal, is in no way equivalent to all religions that have ever existed in the entirety of humanity.
In that book, it's horrendous, awful, hideous stuff. And your Messiah gets up and says, no, all that hideous crap in the Old Testament, it's perfect. It's totally perfect. The only flaw in it is that you human beings are just not able to live up to the perfectness of that law. The law that says, let a raped woman, marry her rapist or be killed with him. The law that says, here's how badly you can beat a slave. As long as he doesn't die, you're cool. These are the people who get if you don't raise your kids in it, you're a bad person. If you don't believe it, there's something wrong. How can you be moral and not be involved in this? And it's like, I don't know how you can be moral and be involved in it. I mean, I see moral people involved in it, but I don't know how they came out of that.
This is an interesting issue to me. When theists make the argument that atheists are just damaged from negative personal experiences, and where they say, well, you didn't experience true religion because these negative things that you're talking about just don't happen. Name me a contemporary Christian community where the victims of rape are forced to marry their rapists. What you're talking about is something of historical interest. And while it's true to say that in terms of the fundamentalists, in terms of the Calvinists, the people who argue for the inerrancy of the Bible, that we don't need, for example, to know the culture in order to understand the message at the time that it occurred, then, yeah, I mean, for those literalists, the textual issues of the Bible do present serious problems to what they are arguing. But again, you're presenting this as, if you're religious, then you necessarily conform to all of the worst parts of the worst doctrines of Christianity. And this still doesn't address the issue of where does a Buddhist stand on these particular issues, but it really doesn't even address the issue of where does a contemporary Christian stand on these issues. And certainly have the discussion. I do bring these points up when I have discussions with Christians. I do hold their feet to the fire over these issues, but I'm not going to poison the well. That's the difference here, what I see between the two of us. I'm not going to start off by saying I just can't understand how a human being could subscribe to this. You need to understand that human beings use religion various ways, and that for a lot of people it's something that they've grown up with. Other people it's something that they've come into, but it becomes a part of their environment socially. It becomes a part of their needs emotionally, and you can look down on it, but it's not going to get you any closer to understanding. So when you say, I just don't get it, I just don't understand this, the flaw is yours. If you want understanding, then you need to drop the pretension. You need to drop the anger, at least to the point that you can sit down and discuss religion rationally with religious people.
Right? I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy world that gets the gold star.
It is crazy world. It has always been crazy world. When you are talking about entities with minds, you have craziness. Nature in and of itself does not have any moral commitments, any moral standards. Things just happen, and there's no call for sanity. There's nothing to compare events against, saying, could they have gone this way? Could they have gone that way? We are talking about the world of human beings. Yes, it will be crazy, because the real truths, the real hard truths in life are counterintuitive. And as we've discussed before, if we're going to have a just society, it has to be one that we build. We cannot rely on any kind of supernatural, extrasolar, extraterrestrial intelligence until such a thing would ever be proven to be true. We have to build it ourselves. But the only way to do that is to get to know the rest of humanity.
I think the tarnish of that gold star is starting to fade, especially when you talk to young people. Christians are actually kind of freaking out about this. There was this big study that was asked, of Christians, how do you see Christianity? And a lot of it, this is among people who believe it, a lot of them saw it as in many ways very negative. And it said things like, I see Christianity as being anti-gay. I see Christianity as being intolerant of people who are different. And, you know, especially I think on the anti-gay issue, young people in this country are overwhelmingly pro-gay. And Christianity is losing those people to a great extent because they see Christianity as being homophobic, which, much of the time it is. Not universally, but much of the time it is.
I appreciate that little correction at the end, but it's evocative of something more. When you say the church is losing these young people. That is not necessarily the case. Much of the time, Christianity is homophobic. Much of the time, it isn't. There's competition within American Christianity. It's a kind of free market capitalism. If you don't like what's being preached at your church, you can turn around and go to another church. There has been a large change in American Christianity regarding these issues, and there are places that they're fully willing to take in these disaffected young liberal Christians who want a fresher, more humanistic perspective, but still have spiritual needs, emotional needs, feel that they have a place in a church, and that they'd be lost in the world without a church. And Christianity is throwing something out there for them. And so while I do appreciate criticizing Christianity for its homophobia and for its sexism, you run the risk of saying things that are actually factually untrue when you don't take into account that such a Christianity exists.
And so that's actually another reason, a positive reason why we should take on social change issues. Because if we can be seen as, hey, yeah, those are the Christian assholes who are saying that your gay friends are going to burn in hell because they love each other. We are the awesome non-believers who think this life is all there that we have and that people should love each other.
And that works great until a newcomer who isn't entirely into atheism plus, feminism, your social theory, comes to your forum, leaves some comments, asks some questions, and is marginalized by the commenters there, is ridiculed and abused because, say, they despise homophobia but don't believe in privilege. So they say things you agree with in a thread on homophobia, feel comfortable and confident to go into another thread, say some things you disagree with about privilege, and then get savaged by the commenters. Now, what's that done for the atheism movement?
I also work on another program called the Atheist Experience, and on that show we often get callers who ask, you guys atheists, what do you believe about fill in the blank? And it's tough because the show is put out to spread information about atheism, yet, like you're saying, what the hell information is there about atheism? I don't believe God exists. End of the show.
Indeed. A criticism that is often made of atheism by YouTube users like Stigmadane of why do you have this atheist identity and these atheist shows and atheist media attempting to spread information on atheism when there is no information to spread? So yes, I do certainly appreciate this position, but it's just kind of a word game. If it was the anti-theist experience, then that would be one thing. But yeah, I mean, I think that over the years, the atheist experience has done a very good job of walking this line of presenting information in terms of, here are positive claims that religious people make, primarily Christian, little bit claims made by Muslims, but really more just kind of monotheism, the traditions that we are familiar with in America, and saying these are the kinds of objections that almost all atheists have. And in that way, it's a really good resource. The show is a really good resource for atheists who are struggling with different kinds of issues, doubts, and so forth, different kinds of arguments and apologetics that they're presented with. And I mean, I think that's a very decent answer to the question of why have the atheist experience? What is there to talk about? And the answer is, well, as atheists, we go through our dialogues with religious people, and some of them very pleasant and understanding, some of them very hostile, and we appreciate having a forum, right? We don't have churches. You know, we don't come together once a week to discuss issues and so forth. And these podcasts, this atheist media, is culturally, that is how we communicate, how we bring ideas back and forth between each other, and how we engage in these dialogues of what do we actually have in common, if anything, is through phenomena like the atheist experience.
I think the plus is really what, for me, made me say, okay, this is not about redefining atheism, because I would have backlashed to that myself.
So I appreciate this statement. This, I think, is this actually addresses what the criticism is, where people, I think, are uncomfortable with atheism plus. This idea that, yes, the statement is that somehow to be a real atheist, you have to have these particular beliefs. For example, if you reject the idea of privilege, social privilege, male privilege, white privilege, and so forth, then you're not a real atheist. You're going to be marginalized. The problem here is I became aware of Atheism Plus through Cobra Jones' video, where he read Richard Carrier's blog post that said exactly that, expressly that if you aren't with us, then you will be cast out, you'll be marginalized. We will do everything we can to see to it that you are pilloried. And it's kind of, this behavior has kind of continued, this idea of if people get on our bad side, then we're going to call for them to be denounced and give public apologies and humiliate themselves, bow and scrape before us until we feel that they are sufficiently apologetic. So while I appreciate that last statement of, yes, we should not be making a kind of an ideological framework where people have to rethink atheism in order to be a part of an atheist plus group. I just want to point out that the evidence here is that that's exactly what is happening. It's very much I think, a legitimate concern, a legitimate fear among people who are saying, whoa, 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 slow down, slow down, slow down. What's all this talk of ostracizing people and blacklisting people? What's really going on with this?
But is there a significant difference for anyone who might be concerned about it between atheism plus and simply being a progressive atheist?
20-second answers and then all possible.
I really don't give a damn what people call themselves. As if they are atheists and they're on board with social justice, then they're a friend of mine.
I'm sorry, but that's a stupid answer. I don't care what you call yourself, as long as you're an atheist who shares my values, you're a friend of mine. I don't care what people call themselves. I don't care if someone is an atheist. If someone holds the same positions that I do about what is good for people and what is bad for people, then in this sense, we're friends. In this sense, the labels are totally without value, totally without merit. In terms of addressing a political movement, what's important are the policies, the positions themselves. In terms of addressing individual identity, what's important is the people, the things that they believe, the values that they espouse, how they live. I think what's most important to remember here is that we're having this discussion centers a lot on words. We're discussing what labels are appropriate and what labels would be best suited to the values espoused by certain movements. My basic stance on this has always been, your data set is people. Your data set is not actually the words. The words have to work in the service of the people. Those are the real existential units that are doing things, not the words themselves. The words are arbitrary and symbolic and are in the service of describing the people. That's what I think is most important in this, and I think the biggest concern of people who have given this criticism for Atheism Plus, why the word divisive has come up, why it's described as divisive, about using words to draw lines, to, on the one hand, hedge people in and tell them that if you are in this group, then you must have these beliefs. And on the other hand, to keep people out, to say that if you are in this other group, then you can't claim our beliefs. The intersection, the overlap between atheism and secular humanism was discussed here, but the overlap, the intersection between atheism and Christianity was not discussed. And that's where I think the question that Erin Raw asked, that she was responding to here, is very much worthwhile. The real question here is, what's the overlap between progressive Christians and progressive atheists? And I think the stupidity of the response was in saying, if you share my social values and you're an atheist, you're a friend of mine. That, as I discussed earlier, is not going to get you where you need to go.